Okay, I think we might make a start now. So welcome everyone to our webinar on the Westley Park mountain bike trails. My name is Darius Turner. I'm from Captivate Consulting, and we've been engaged by Council to lead the engagement on this really exciting project. We've run 4 workshops so far, and it's been really great to meet. We've met over 100 people in person and talking to people on the phone and by email. It's been really interesting to hear all of the different perspectives. So before we start today, just going to try my next slide. There we go. Before we start today, it's really important that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all individually meet today. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands of Hornsby Shire, the Darug and Guringai peoples, and pay respect to ancestors and elders past, present and emerging, and to their heritage. And I would like to acknowledge and uphold their intrinsic connections and continuing relationships to country. And as we've said at the workshop, it's really important that we do remember these connections to country as we talk about land and Westley Park. So welcome and introductions. So today we have 3 presenters. I'll be facilitating, and we're really lucky to be joined by these 3 presenters. And they are Professor Catherine Pickering from Griffith University, Phil Downey, who is a local mountain biking representative and a member of SNORC, Steve Federer from Hornsby Shire Council, the Community and Environment Division Director, and myself. And I do notice, and I'll just have a quick look again at some of the people who have joined us. I do notice that we do have some of the councillors and the council project team and executive online as well, which we appreciate. So our project purpose, it's quite clear that the project purpose is, it's stemmed from a council resolution. And our mission is to involve the mountain biking and environmental communities in developing a co-designed concept plan of mountain bike trails at Westley Park while protecting the high value areas of the bushland. And in the workshops, we've found out that this is, it's quite a complex piece of engagement that we're doing. There are a lot of different perspectives, and it's been great to hear them so far. And this webinar is just part of the broader engagement process that will get us to that co-designed concept planning stage. So I'll just skip through to the engagement process. So far we have had 4 stakeholder workshops. We've had 2 mountain biking workshops and 2 environment and other stakeholder workshops. And we really appreciate everyone who has shown an interest in those and has come along and shared their thoughts and views. Today we are running a webinar, and the main purpose of this webinar is to share more detailed information. So some of the information on this project at times can be contested. So we did think it was important to get a few different perspectives of experts who have spent a lot of time in this field. And we're looking forward to hearing those insights today. Following today's webinar, which will be recorded and also put online for people who can't join this session to watch later, we'll be doing an expression of interest process for people to take part in the co-design workshop. And if you've registered for this webinar, then you'll receive information on how to become involved in that process. And that process will involve co-design workshops, which will happen in April. And that's when we'll get into the detail of the draft concept plans of mountain bike trails at Westley Park, which will go on exhibition in May 2022. And there'll be opportunities for public feedback at that stage as well. So our agenda for today, we do have an hour. So we're nearly finished the welcome and introductions. And then I'll be handing over to Professor Catherine Pickering, who will be talking for about 25 minutes. And then we have some shorter presentations from Phil Downey and Steve Federer before we go on to wrap up the next steps. So I'm going to introduce Professor Pickering in a moment and read out that bio. It's quite an impressive bio that we can see there. Before I do that, I'll just talk a little bit of housekeeping about the way this webinar is being run. So as I've mentioned, it's quite a comprehensive engagement program that we are running. It's over a number of months. And the main purpose of today is information sharing. So you'll see that there's not necessarily a chat function amongst participants. So if you do have a question, I believe that we've enabled correctly for you to send questions only to the panelists and myself. And those questions we'll have a look at, and we'll record them, and we'll make an effort to answer those questions as we go on in the engagement process. But today is mainly about information sharing from the experts, and we have had lots of opportunities for people to provide feedback in the earlier workshops and also in the upcoming workshops. So we hope that's okay with everyone who's joining us today. So Professor Pickering, It's quite a bio there. Catherine is an expert in plant ecology and climate change and recreation ecology, and has a range of focus areas such as protected area management and community gardens and how they're being used for conservation. Catherine leads a large research group focusing on applied issues relating to nature interactions, including projects all across the world, including Australia, USA, South Africa, Nepal, and other countries. Currently, Catherine is at Griffith University teaching urban ecology and biodiversity. And Catherine's won a number of awards for her work, and it looks after PhD and master's students. And we're really, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're really privileged to welcome Catherine to our webinar today. So thank you, Catherine. I'll stop sharing. And if you can please share your screen, we look forward to hearing from you.
The host disabled participant screen sharing. So it's coming up. So sorry about that. Just a technical issue okay. There. We're sorting it.
Try that now. And it doesn't matter how many run-throughs and test runs you do. There we go. It wouldn't be a webinar or a Zoom meeting without a little glitch, so that's good. Thank you. And if you can just put it onto the slideshow mode, we are good to go. Thank you, Catherine.
Okay, so first of all, welcome everyone. And the role that I've got here today is mostly just about sharing insights from research that's been conducted in a range of countries, including in Australia. And in doing so, I'll emphasize a little bit more some of the Australian-based research. And in doing this, I come to it as somebody who does research in social and environmental aspects of mountain biking and other recreational activities. And in particular, for example, being the co-editor of a special issue of a Journal of Outdoor Tourism, Recreation and Mountain Biking. So in terms of that, it's just to give you an idea of the context and background of who I am and what I'll be calling on to present to you today. And really important about acknowledging traditional owners. In my case, I'm actually in the Gold Coast, so it's the Kombumerri Together people. And as always, acknowledge the traditional custodians of that we are meeting, including for me, the Kombumerri here on the Gold Coast. Now, what I wanted to do is actually, I'm just summarizing a whole lot of research that's been done on mountain biking. I'm particularly focusing on that about the social and environmental aspects of it. There are a whole lot of research in health and also a whole lot about accidents. I have to say, if you want to do research on mountain biking, there's a whole theme all around about the risks about it, but I'm going to be focusing on those social and environmental about the landscape and where they occur and what interactions happen around that. And on the right, I've got a visualization of keywords from over 300 papers on mountain biking, just to give you some of the idea of the sort of things that have been done in those areas looking at social and environmental. And what it's highlighted is that there's increasing number and diversity of people and places that people are riding, but also there's the potential conflict, social conflict, including perceptions about the appropriateness of the activities amongst stakeholders and land managers. Now, if I look like I'm not looking at you guys, apology, I've got two screens going, so I'm flipping up to the slides on the top screen. A really important issue is in minimizing environmental impacts, and that's the field of recreation ecology. And therefore, this research, the idea of it is to help inform debate and decision. So it's done there to help to answer questions that you may have. And that's what we're about. So depending on who you are listening in and your particular perspectives and perceptions and the stakeholder groups that you may be representing or views around it, you may like some of what I'm saying and not some of the other parts of it. But the idea of this is to say, this is what the research says. And with that, in mountain biking, there are some really common themes coming up. There's around the theme for demand, and that is that there are increasing demands. There's a diversity of use, issues around access, landscapes, facilities, and alternatives. In the social issues, there's important research about who goes bike riding, but also what other activities are occurring. Is there issues to do with displacement? What are people's perceptions, values, attitudes, and is there conflict? In the ecological issues, a lot of the research is focusing on landscape ecological sensitivity, trail level impacts, impacts from riding, and impacts from unauthorized trails. And this is some of the material that I'm going to go through. On the right, you can see is a graphic illustrating a long and complicated philosophy component of social theory, which is about the idea that our values are our guiding principles, and they shape our beliefs and then our attitudes. And then our attitudes shape concepts such as perceptions, behavior, and motivation. And the reason I've put that in is I'm also going to be at times showing you results of research about what are the values, attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors of mountain bikers, and also how that relates to other recreational activities in natural areas. And so these are some of that area covered by the social research. And I've been asked to talk about that, and also to talk about the field called recreation ecology, which is understand the ecological impacts of different types of recreational activities and mechanisms to how to minimize those impacts. So in terms of social research, there's a lot of work that's been done on who goes mountain biking, where do they go, when and why. So and this is really important to understand the principles about this. And I know that there's a fair number of mountain bikers listening in today, so you can see whether any of this relates to you or you feel identified in this in the results of the research. But some of the common things is that it's much more commonly undertaken by men. Often people are younger and people are well educated who go mountain biking, and that's both overall compared to the general population and also in comparison to some other common recreation activities. Where people go riding is highly diverse. It can be urban parks and natural areas through to remote national parks, but particularly urban areas are very popular globally. It can be on multi-use trails, single-use trails, and off-trail. And it can involve a whole lot of different types of activities. And I'll be talking about some of this more in the diversity of mountain biking. So it can be long distance touring, trails, adventure racing, all sorts of things happening. And part this reflects an increasing interest in it, but also an increasing technical capacity of mountain bikes and what they can do, and also specialization for different types of mountain biking. And one of the big ones that's coming at the moment is, of course, e-mountain bikes. And there's a whole lot of interesting issues that are happening around the use of those. And when there are surveys done of what do riders want in trails, it can differ from what hikers and runners want, particularly where bikers might want longer, steeper, single track, more technical challenges. But also within mountain biking, there can be a lot of variation depending on the type of rider, the age, the group size, etc. So others want flat, wide, easy to use family style trails, etc. Often want more trails and riding opportunities. And this is the biggest challenge of all, is this concept of unmet demand. And that can result in riding where it's not authorized. And this is the big issue. And this is why we're doing some of this research, and when we get asked to talk about it is because of this unmet demand and then the challenges around dealing with that and addressing it. So some of our own research is looking at where in Australia. And this is where we looked at 40 national parks in southeast Queensland. And what you can find is that walking, running, and mountain biking are increasingly popular in national parks, but the major thing is areas close to urban areas. And what we found is there was a massive drop-off as soon as you got more than 2 kilometres away from a major urban centre. So people want to go and do these activities, but they particularly want to do them really close to urban areas, to where people live. When we also looked at who goes mountain biking, and this is for some urban national parks in southeast Queensland, there were some intercept surveys done. And these results I'm presenting here are similar to what's been found in lots of other places. We've just submitted a paper looking at research in Barcelona, in a large urban park there. And it's coming up with some of the same sorts of patterns. And that is that, again, as I mentioned, mountain bike riders tend to be more commonly male, university educated, and between 25 and 54 years old. Although one of the things I'll note there is that e-biking is changing some of that in terms of increasing an older demographic to engage with mountain biking. They tend to visit urban parks frequently and more often in smaller groups than hikers. And recent data, when we've looked at the same parks over the last 3 years on trail forks, has found exactly the same thing, but even on trail forks, even greater dominance of men. On the right, you can see as a sort of summary of the difference between mountain bikers and hikers and how they were using. And you can see that one of the things about the hikers is they tend to be older. It's more equal male and female. People tend to come often in larger groups, and they might spend longer in the park compared to mountain bikers. We've also done a whole lot of quite detailed analysis of the actual pattern of use of urban parks. So what routes, what trails, when do people come? And this is the result of the research that was done in a really popular mountain biking area in Brisbane, Daisy Hill and adjacent parks. And the top one is showing you which days of the week mountain bikers, runners and walkers come. And as you can see, there's a massive increase on weekends, whereas for running, although weekends were popular, running was popular more during the whole of the week. What it does mean is if there's going to be conflict on multi-use parks or with other users, it's more likely to occur on the weekend. Down the bottom left is showing you the distance that people went when they came on weekdays and weekends. And a really obvious difference is that mountain bikers go much further. So for each time they come to the park, they will actually go more than 10 kilometers, and in some cases a lot more than that. And that's different to runners who do go a reasonable distance, but not as far as mountain bikers, and hikers, of course, do the shortest distances. And on the right, what we have is a map showing you a whole lot of the trails. And what it's showing you is which were the dominant trails used by the mountain bikers and which were the dominant trails used by the walkers and hikers. And in this park, most of these trails are actually mixed use. They're allowed to be used for all three activities. There were a couple of single track mountain bike trails within that. But what you can see is that the actual pattern of usage, because of going further, people used much more of the park and did quite complicated patterns of it. And we actually analysed the individual route shapes to find out whether it was circular, figure of eight, longer combinations of what actual trail patterns were. But what it highlighted is that issue about the greater use of the park going further into the park with mountain biking. We also have done research where we actually looked at motivations, and although there are some similarities in, for example, compared to hikers, mountain bikers are often more focused on engaging in recreational activities for adventure and challenge, whereas hikers can also sometimes be more focused on rest and relaxation and spending time with family and friends. And that relates to that issue about the group size, etc. On the right is a diagram where we did a really interesting thing when I was talking to you about values and perceptions. So we had looked at motivations, and then we actually also asked a series of questions about people's perceptions about their own and other activities that were happening in the same place. So on the left-hand axis, it's got perceptions of others, positive versus negative. So positives at the top, negatives at the bottom. And at the bottom, what the x-axis is what we've got is environmental values orientation. And this is a values system that's been used in a whole lot of research to see if people are focused more about people or more about nature and their value system. And what it's basically saying is that the mountain bikers actually tend to be quite nature focused. Their value system is in the top half of that distribution, and it means that they are very positively focused on other users in general and very positively focused and have a value system that focuses on nature. And this is a really important issue because sometimes some of the conflict around mountain biking comes out of perceptions of otherness, and part of that can be expressed as issues around they have a different value set. So values can be similar, perceptions can be similar, but motivations can be different, is what we're showing in this pattern, in this research. Now, mountain bikers, of course, are not all the same. So we like different things. People when they go mountain biking, people when they go hiking, people when they go into nature, the same individual might have different preferences, and certainly amongst that user group, you get differences. And so with that, you can get things like gravity, people liking downhill, free riding style, speed, single track and natural areas. You can have all-round riding, single track, but also gravel and in natural areas, cross country with a preference for single track, cross-country on gravel tracks. And this captures in a whole lot of terminology and language that gets used, and I'll be using some of those terms elsewhere around this. And we know that in many urban settings, you're going to get different cohorts of mountain bikers, including people who might want flat, wide, open areas to go with riding with their kids and introduce it as a shared activity, compared to people who are wanting really steep, downhill, single track. And this becomes really important, both of sharing with others and also within the mountain biking community. And so you can get conflict within the mountain biking community with others, particularly amongst riders with the speed and downhill and those who want the broad and flat. Lots of mountain bikers want to help with trail maintenance, and that's been found in lots of studies in lots of different places. And riding in natural areas is common, but in many cases it's unauthorized. And this gets to that issue of the demand. So that's some of the social aspects, and I hope that's helped with that. I'm now just going to talk about some of the environmental impacts. And one of the most important ones is just to say trails have impacts. Now, trails from mountain biking, trails from hiking, trails used have impacts. In recreation ecology research, we can reduce those by having good trail design, layout, and construction, but there are some that are just inherent to that. And so what I've done here is I've listed the impacts that are associated with the use of trails, the impacts on the trail itself, and the impacts on the edge of the trails. And I've put a little star in for those that could be reduced by having well-designed trails, but also noting that there are other impacts that simply exist. And the really obvious one is if you cut a trail, you've cut out vegetation, you've reduced the amount of habitat there is for wildlife, you've increased heat, wind, area, and you can have a whole lot of issues around changing animal behavior as a result. And that even also the presence of trails has an effect, so does the use of the trails. And so we just want to make it really clear. And there's a lot of research around this generally for trails and also specifically for mountain bike trails. Now, one of the biggest ones, and I've highlighted this before, is the issue around the building of unauthorized trails. And there's a range of terminology that might be used about this. And it includes also trail technical features, which are specific structures built onto the trails to enhance the technical challenge of the ride. And they can be cambers and built up areas, but they can be massive jumps. Now, one of the problems with it is that people, when they build these, can take an enormous amount of pride in them. But unfortunately, they are very, very often poorly designed, and they have more impacts as a result as compared to authorized trails. Now, first of those is that not obtained landowner permission, and this is a really important issue because we don't in our communities have an acceptance that I can go into a natural area of bush and just change it to do whatever I would like, because that's a community held resource and facility. And in doing so, I can actually be degrading that environment for others and for the land use purpose. And one of the issues is that people can unknowingly build them in areas of high conservation value. So the overall area can be of high conservation value, and the use can be incompatible with the land use for that designated for that area, but also within it, people may not know what are the high conservation value plant communities, and so build the trails through those unaware. But also they're often more subject to erosion because the trails can often be steeper, no fall lines or formal drainage established within those trails. And you often get what's also called spaghetti trails within a small area. And that's this complicated network of very intense trails in relatively small areas zigzagging around that area. Now, in areas of high conservation value, that is really important because it has even more impact and more adverse effects on those areas. And there can be use of inappropriate materials, wood, tin, concrete, plastics, all sorts of things. And that has safety issues that make it actually dangerous for other people using those areas at times. There can also be over the whole landscapes important impacts. So the loss of the high conservation value plant communities, simply there was X hectares of it and now there's a lot less because of those trails. but also the area is now fragmented into smaller and smaller patches, and that makes it at higher risk of weeds, of feral animal movements, and also reduces the habitat quality and the capacity in some cases for animals to move across the trails. So there's a whole thing about this sort of large, not just at a single trail, but looking at the whole area. You can get large-scale soil loss and changes in water flows and creeks from the trails associated with that drainage issues, and as I mentioned, reduced habitat for wildlife. You also, a really controversial or continuous issue is what's their relative impacts compared to other activities. And we've actually done really specific research of this where we've ridden trails or ridden off trail and hiked off trail and on trails at different intensities and then measured before and after fixed amounts of use to assess what exactly was the relative impact. And from that, we found that in fact, there were similar impacts per pass. So for a 100-meter area, in terms of loss of vegetation, soil compaction, increase in litter. And we've done research to look at riding on off trails in terms of things like dispersing weed seed, because this is another important long-term impact of recreational use. And we found with that they're different types of weeds picked up and dispersed by mountain bikers versus hikers, but they're not necessarily greater numbers in total. But mountain bikers travel further, go further on a given ride, go use a longer distance, and therefore there is an issue that there's more damage overall. For a 2-hour bike ride, you're going to do more damage than for a 2-hour hike because you're going to be traveling further. So the overall area of the impact can be greater. And as I've already mentioned, one of the big issues is this thing about the creation of those informal trails or unauthorized trails and the trail technical features, and they have major components. So I'm just going to go through a couple of examples and then finish up. So this is Griffith University on the Gold Coast. It's a patch of endangered forest on our campus. And this is one of the pieces of research we got into because suddenly we were finding that there was incredible use of this area of forest for mountain biking, which was not an authorized activity for this forest. And so we had 29 hectares and we found we had 8.6 kilometers of trails and we had a whole lot of trail technical features built into the forest. And as you can see, some of them are just camber lines and ditches, but others of them are quite extensive and quite large structures. And that was a real challenge for our university in what to do because this was unauthorized use, degrading the endangered forest and also having some important social issues. So these are going through what are the issues associated with that particular site and more generally. Well, there are obvious environmental ones, which I've just talked about, to do with loss of native vegetation, soil movement, pollution, that informal trail network, the spread of weeds and pathogens, and wildlife disturbance. But there are both positive and negative social aspects. So the positive is that this reflects a really strong attachment to site, a really strong engagement of people wanting to use this natural area. It was providing recreation facilities, fulfilling an unmet demand. There was a lot of local community involvement, like there was a lot of work people put into these trails. And obviously they have fitness effects and benefits and enhancing people's experience in nature. But there were also some negative social, and that was social conflict with other users, reduced naturalness of the site, reduced safety and personal industry because these trail technical features and trails were not consistent with IMBA standards, deterioration of them, they were falling down, they weren't even safe in and of themselves, and the location of the features on this multi-use track was a real issue. And that provided for our university and for many land managers, these are some of the standard challenges: reduced safety, increased costs with maintenance, massive liability issues, having to manage social and environmental impacts, and communicate with stakeholders to try and achieve acceptable outcomes. There have been some really great successful collaborations where landowners, even at a very large scale, like a whole state in Western Australia, have come together with mountain bikers and other recreational users to try and achieve some really good outcomes. And this is about things like recognizing the difference in mountain bikers and what they want, touring, cross-country, downhill, free riding trails, how that is compatible with other users, pedestrian, horses, etc. And then how that matches onto different types of land use. And so they've done this mapping around that to try and look at what should be provided in what types of land use for whom. And I think this is a really important project around that. It's a really interesting study that's done, and that contributed to the establishment of a massive cross-country trail in Western Australia as well. So what about Westley? Well, one of them is that there are obviously, and I think everyone is very aware of this, a whole lot of trails currently in existence. And they have resulted in the loss of forest and including endangered plant communities, because two of the plant communities that they've been built through are have high conservation value. And this is what we were talking about, that issue that people may not have been realizing it, but it's also because people haven't been talking to the land users, the land managers, and saying, you know, we want to do this, where can we do it? And as a result, you get this sort of impacts. It's fragmented those forests into smaller and smaller patches, which makes them more at risk. There's likely large-scale soil loss, likely changes in hydrology, and likely wildlife avoiding the trails. And if we just look at some photos from the site, you can see some of these impacts straight up. You can see that there's been vegetation's been cleared and cut down. You can see that there are examples of soil erosion where trails have been going down quite steep areas and have not been built with the appropriate structures. You can see the exposure of roots, which is going to undermine the trees growing in those areas, causing further damage. You can see areas where there's been changes in hydrology and the appearance of damp and muddy areas, but also changes in the runoff lines that were happening in the area naturally, and the introductions of materials into those sites. So it's one of the things is that you can look at this in these photos, you might think, oh, look, this looks like a great place to go mountain biking riding. But in terms of environmental issues, these are quite a concern, and they are degrading the natural habitat. That is an unquestioningly what is happening here in these photos. This is not natural vegetation of high conservation value in an intact state. So the problem or the issue that's being addressed by this process to deal with is this common issue that is developing around having a whole lot of unauthorized trails in an area and what's going to happen about it. What are some of the solutions to how to deal with this? So you've got issues about the trails are poorly located because they're traversing high conservation value forest, and it's a spaghetti of trails with lots and lots of quite dense trails in a fairly narrow area. They're not IMBA compliant, resulting in safety issues. They're not an appropriate standard and surface for the councils. There is conflict with the designated land use, and there is conflict among and within groups about what should this land be used for, what should happen to these trails, and that's part of this whole process. So you can see that at the micro scale, or then that focus in this particular location, it's reflecting many of those same broader themes. So strategies going forward. Well, authorized versus unauthorized use is always an ongoing challenge. There's a diversity in what mountain bikers and others want, and that needs to be respected and acknowledged. There is the risk for social conflict with land users and with the regulation and legislation for this land and other areas where similar issues arise. It's really important for everyone to understand others' values, attitudes, experiences, and perceptions, and to acknowledge and recognize those and be respectful about them. And there are risks for safety for people and habitat and wildlife. Now, collaborations is really important, and that's what's happening here, including with mountain bikers and others. And that may involve a mixture of closing some trails and hardening others to become IMBA and council standard. There might be, in some cases, sometimes spatial and temporal separation amongst activities, and that's that issue that you can get conflict if you have people doing different activities on the same, and that can be mountain bikers and others, but it can also be different styles of mountain biking. And the really important concept of alternative sites, so a range of options in the broader landscape. You don't need everything everywhere. So thanks for listening to me, and I've gone slightly over time, but they said I should take the time to give some of this content around it. Now there's some material online. These are a series of PhD theses that have looked at some of these issues that are all publicly available. Now, in addition to that, I've been using a whole lot of research that has been published. This includes a special issue of the Journal of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism and a whole lot of other papers, including a whole lot of papers done by my students and I and international colleagues addressing some of these issues. And the reason I've put them up there is just to give you an idea that in making these comments, it's evidence-based. I'm saying based on summarising the latest research. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Catherine. We really appreciate you sharing all of your expertise and studies with us. We have had a few questions in the chat, so I'll give you a moment to kind of catch your breath after that. It was really good, and well done for sticking to time. And just have a review of some of the questions. The ones that we can answer today, we will, but otherwise, as I said at the start of the webinar, we're making a note of all of those questions, and we'll have a considered response for everyone before we get to the co-design phase of the project. So we appreciate the people who are making those questions, just bearing with us on that and having a bit of patience as we get back to you, because there is a bit of detail in some of the questions. So thank you so much. So I'll now hand over to Phil Downey. So Phil, do you mind just putting yourself, I'll ask you to unmute. There we go. And do you mind sharing your screen if that's okay?
Yep, just give me a moment.
Brilliant.
Is that there on the screen?
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
So I'm just going to give you an overview today of the mountain biking group at cohort at Westley and some of the nuances and difference about Westley and the Hornsby area as it comes to mountain biking. Taking into account there's a lot of data points out there, and I think traditionally men have been part of the bulk of the sport. You're going to find that Westley is a lot different. And that's a good thing because it brings diversity to our community. So if we look at mountain biking, and I pulled this out of a GHD report from Oz Cycling just recently, and because it really aligned when the proposal for the master plan came out last year. We spent a lot of time out there talking to different people about what they got out of it. And it really closely aligns with some of the data that Catherine talked about. Mental health was a key, proximity to nature. You'll find that most mountain bikers are environmentalists at heart as well. A lot of them want to actually be engaged in rehabilitation. In fact, some of the site had been originally rehabilitated because a lot of the forest was overwhelmed with plants such as privet and lantana, etc. And the lantana disappeared and people put trails in there. But the key thing is physical health, well-being, and mental well-being and proximity to where we are. And that gives us a great feeling, like Catherine's data. People do ride during the week, and there's a peak on weekends, and you'll see a peak on weekends, particularly on nice sunny weekends down at Westley, because we get a lot of families going in there with their children, mum and dad, etc. And these people come from a broad range of individuals. So we spoke to a very large number of people over a large number of weekends in there, and asking them, particularly over COVID as well, why they were there. There's a lot of passive recreation from the local community out there. If you looked at COVID, when we had the lockdown within 5 kilometres of where you live or within your LGA, the numbers out at Westley actually boomed, right? Because people couldn't travel out to their desired gravity trail or long distance trail. People get in cars and they'll drive 100 kilometres in a weekend or 50 kilometres up to Wiseman's Ferry to ride, but they're more your sporting type, less your passive recreational and your active recreational type. The active recreational guys were going 2, 3, 4 times a week, depending on what their job or after school and the seasons were. A lot of boys and girls going out on their own in their groups, and a lot of passive recreation, a lot of families, lots of mum and dads. In fact, the picture to the right-hand side there, we had people laying out picnic rugs, and one parent would go for a ride of the trail, hand the child over to the baby over and feeding the baby there, which I was quite surprised about. I wouldn't be actually sitting there in the dust. But you can see that it is actually quite a wide variety, and that's because of the nature of trails there at Westley are a bit more open to all different levels. And I'll touch a little bit on that as to why it's popular and what's been important to the people when we got that sort of feedback talking to them. The key thing, it appeals to everybody. So, Old Man's Valley, we're used to the gravity, the more technical, the more challenging, the more adrenaline run. During the week out at Westley, like there was one gentleman last night talking at one of the sessions, he's in his 70s. He actually rides out there He says it's a great environment on weekends because he gets to talk to people outside his family group that are younger than 70. So it gives him that level of engagement. And there are lots of families, mums and kids, both going out after school, but primarily on week afternoons. And obviously during COVID, team sports were down, and we're seeing a lot more of that. But you'll see a higher percentage of females and diverse community groups out there. And we also have riding groups. So there's two parts to the community. We have groups of friends that get together and they ride. They're all of mixed ability. Some are, dare I say it, somewhat more overweight and not capable or skillful enough to do complex trails, and they'll stay on the simpler stuff, while their friends will go and do the harder stuff. And one of the great things about mountain biking is that people are a little bit more forgiving, right? If you're not forgiving on a competitive sport such as football, rugby league, netball, tennis, those sort of things get really competitive between the players and sometimes within their own team. In mountain biking, people are very much more forgiving. They realize everybody's got a different skill level, and they appreciate the fact that people are just getting out there and getting involved. And that's certainly the feeling around Hornsby and the Westley mountain bike trails and the people that go there. In fact, we've had families move into the area to get proximity to trails that they can ride with their partner, or they can ride with their children that have that capability to be able to have different levels of skills in the one area. And it brings people together. So as per that gentleman last night saying, which is we've always found, you go out to the site and you talk to one another. You meet people that you wouldn't otherwise meet in your day-to-day life. You have a chat. It might be about mountain biking. It might be about something else. People from all areas of the political, socio-economic status are out there actually riding. And nobody really seems to mind, are you going fast enough? How hard are you participating? What's your Strava time? That's not important. The important is that people are out there relaxing, enjoying themselves and staying fit. What have people been attracted to probably in the type of trails that we have out there? Well, it's the fact that there is beginner green style trails, which give enough length and variety for a younger, less skilled person, or an older person, or a person just generally being not wanting to take any risks or overexert themselves to get off and start running. Now, their friends may be intermediate level. So they'll leave them at some point in the trail, go down the intermediate, and they'll meet at the trailhead, and there'll be a sense of community there. And likewise, going out to the more experienced. So it has something for the extreme of sporting side, as well as the beginner side. And we've had a number, particularly female champions, come out of the area in mountain biking who have spent a lot of their time training at this facility, because particularly for the younger kids, and it gives them a place that they can start, they can get going, and they can get back into it. And, you know, I would describe it as somewhat of a hump curve, in that you start off, you begin at the beginners, you go to the intermediate, you go to the experience, and then you're going to head back intermediate to beginners as perhaps you get older. And that's why we get a full range. We have kids in the 3-year-old on basically balance bikes riding, all right, around the beginner section. And we also have older people in their 70s up to 80 riding in the beginner section and some of the intermediate trail that fits their need without taking a reasonable level of risk. You can fall over and you can have accidents pretty much anywhere. It depends on how hard you push it and how smart you are in going to your level of ability. But the main thing is to be able to provide people that choice. Whereas if you look at scenarios like Old Man's Valley, it's a little bit more at the gravity sport level, and a lot more potential to actually have accidents. And mountain biking is having a very positive influence. We see obviously the rise of the Snork Mountain Bike Club. Synergy Trails, trail building comes out of this area and is participating in some of the council activities, and they don't just do mountain bike trails, but they do walking trails, etc. Things like, I think they were involved in the Grand Canyon up in the Blue Mountains. We have rocky trails that are from around the area. We have mountain bike coaching starting up. You're seeing a lot more schools introduce it as a sport. Last night, we had people talking about scouting groups that go out and actively ride. And the other key thing is the impact on the local businesses. We've had really just 2 cycle shops in the area, Ku-ring-gai Cycles and Cycle Sport. I remember when I was a child at Westley, there was actually a bike shop here. And as it became less and less friendly to ride on the road, more and more restrictions. And of course, you know, for conservation reasons, a lot more of the trail around the area became less available to push bikes. There's less sales. Over the last 6-7 years, we've seen a growth, additional, and a big investment from 99 Bikes and Giant to come into the area. All that happening when people are doing mail order online from Chain Reaction, etc., their parts. And that is just grown by the fact of the demand for not only the bike itself, but servicing, parts, clothing, helmets, etc., as well as in a formalized cycling environment where it's appealing to that broader cross-section of the community rather than your adrenaline male style of rider. You're going to bring a lot more people together in a casual manner, spilling over into the local businesses such as cafes, etc. Australian Cycling did a report into mountain biking, and it has some environmental benefits, because what it does, and one of my colleagues goes on about this, his son was very much into sport, fell out of love in terms of competition. He got him into mountain biking. He would never look at the bush or go bushwalking, etc. with him. It got the boy interested in the bush, interested in other recreation, and now he can get him out hiking, etc. as well, because he's had that positive experience. But you also see a lot of environmental benefits, because you'll see, you know, we have a lack of people engaging potentially in bush regeneration around the area. We see a lot of, you know, sites open, but not a lot of people participating. What you'll find is with mountain bikers, we all want to actually participate in maintaining the trails, etc., particularly in areas like Westley, where perhaps, you know, over the last several years, people have been less willing or not wanting to, because the rules are we can't make any changes out there. There have been some jumps that Catherine's shown that some kids went in and built. But generally speaking, people are not maintaining the trails, and that's what can happen when you're not getting that ongoing maintenance and no rules based around it. But in a managed mountain bike trail environment, you'll get a lot of volunteers and people interested in regenerating the bush. Social benefits and health benefits, as we've talked about, and also the economic benefits. So in summary, from a Westley perspective, mountain biking is both a sport, it's an active and occasional recreation, and it's a community thing. And it's participated in by people of all abilities and backgrounds, with an increasing amount of female presence. It helps local business, and it's become an increasing area of interest in Hornsby Council, particularly with people moving into the area because they like walking in the bush and they like riding in the bush. So I'll leave it there, Darius.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Phil. Great presentation. Really appreciate it. So we do only have about 10 minutes. It's the hour's flown by, but Steve, there's been a couple of questions, and Catherine's happy to just talk really quickly for 1 or 2 minutes to them, and then I'll go to you and give you about 10 minutes to finish up, if that's okay. Catherine?
Just in terms of 2 things. One of them is that although we over in Queensland think that we're different to the rest of Australia, actually it's not that different in a whole lot of things around that. And I think it's really important to recognise that some people were asking about, well, this is research from Southeast Queensland and that doesn't apply in Sydney. Now, in every particular circumstance, there are going to be things that are specific to the particular land and the context, but those patterns are really quite general internationally and locally. And it is an important issue that is starting to be addressed by some mountain biking groups, etc., to try and diversify who's going mountain biking in terms of age and demographics. But it still is the case that it's predominantly a male organised activity, and particularly at the higher levels of intermediate and extreme, that it is around that. So just around that to say that, you know, some of the research I presented was actually from wide flat paths near cities, and that was still showing this strong male bias around it. So diversifying it, something is active, but it still is a big issue around it.
Cool. Thank you, Catherine. And like I've said throughout the webinar, there are quite a few questions there, and because of the time and the complexity. We're not endeavouring to answer all of them within the hour, but we'll be preparing more information to respond to those questions as we go through this process, which is still going to go for about another 4 to 6 weeks. So Steve, I'll give you 10 minutes if that's okay. Do your best to stick to that. And Steve's going to give a bit of a council perspective on the project. So thank you, Steve.
Sure, and thank you, Darius, and thank you to Catherine and Phil, who spoke earlier. So yeah, I'm going to touch on Westley Park specifically and provide some sort of background to the rise of demand and unmet demand for mountain biking through Hornsby, but also to touch briefly on a proposed link, which many of the people who are tuned into this webinar would be aware of through the master plan process that Council commenced last year. So in terms of mountain biking through the Shire, probably the point that is really clear for Council is it's not a new thing that has just arrived recently. Council has done a whole range of studies over time for recreation more broadly. It wasn't recreation in terms of specifically mountain biking, but through all of those studies, the community feedback has identified mountain biking as something that community are wanting to participate in. And the fact that there's a lack of facilities where that's able to be conducted in where there's an authorised facility or a constructed and maintained facility by the landowner, be it council or other landowners. So that goes back to the early 2000s, where, you know, at a time when a leisure strategic plan was prepared by council, feedback at that point noted that, you know, mountain biking was something that the community was starting to participate in, and that they were identifying a lack of facilities. Now, that plan looked much more widely than just, as I said, mountain biking. It looked at how people wanted to recreate across the Shire for structured recreation, unstructured, a whole range of things, and that came forward. Knowing and identifying that, you know, fast forwarding a few years, council specifically prepared an unstructured recreation strategy, because I think we've heard earlier, you know, there's a cohort in our community very much that are involved and participate and get value out of our structured sports, our soccers, our crickets, our basketballs and the like. But there's still many people within the community that want to participate in unstructured recreation, and something like mountain biking fits within that, but there are many other activities as well. So that strategy, once again, wasn't specific to mountain biking, but through that, again, it was identified that, you know, there was demand for that. It noted that there were a range of informal trails across the Shire, and largely what that was arising out of and coming back to us was that, you know, there wasn't dedicated facilities that were being provided. So people were participating in the activity in locations where there were informal trails, and often they were closer to where the people were. That then really turned council's mind and focus to say, well, we've got this this demand here. We know that there's informal trails being created. How are we able to, as a community, better manage that? You know, is it something that's suitable for us to actually look at, saying, well, maybe council needs to consider the provision of a facility which can take some of that that demand and allow people to participate in the activity in a way where it's properly provided and maintained. And so, you know, in 2009, there was a report that went to council that recommended that we do look into investigating a mountain bike trail in Hornsby, and it noted Old Man's Valley as a location to include in amongst that. Continuing with the background, you know, that then led forward to follow-up feedback to council, or another report to council, which had looked across the Shire at a range of locations where mountain biking might be able to be provided. And some of that was, you know, where people were telling us they wanted to ride. Others was where we knew that there were some informal trails. There were quite a number of sites that were identified in those, and some of those were, you know, on the western side of the gorge out towards Galston or Arcadia. Others were much closer on this side where where greater density of population is in Hornsby. And through that, Old Man's Valley was identified as a preferred site for council, and there were a number of reasons for that. One, its proximity to population, the fact that there were areas on that site that had been disturbed, and some of the other sites had higher ecological values at the time, which meant that they fell away and Old Man's Valley became the preferred site. Many of the people on this call know that, council ended up progressing and constructing a mountain bike trail at Hornsby, or Old Man's Valley. And that was done in 2011, 2012. And one of the points I wanted to draw out amongst that, that really came through clearly from the community who were using that site, was that it was identified as being really important at that time that Old Man's Valley actually provided beginner and intermediate level trails, because that was something that the mountain biking community had identified and said, we don't just want the most advanced and the most technical things. There's a spectrum of people who want to participate, and we need to be able to provide for everybody. And that was a really, really important thing that was brought out and raised with council. Now, you've heard other presenters talk about, Old Man's Valley is providing more of a more advanced riding experience at the moment, and that is correct. And some of those changes occurred through the time when North Connects had access to the quarry site, and some of those beginner trails were around the Old Man's Valley flat platform, which were interrupted for that work at North Connects and haven't been able to be reinstated. So that clearly has actually shifted the focus of Old Man's Valley towards more advanced riding experience. The other point that we wanted to bring out, and I know that Catherine had talked about, any trail has impact, and that's correct. But looking at Old Man's Valley, there were quite a number of concerns that were expressed when council was considering approving that trail. And a lot of them talked about the fact that, we do have the trail construction themselves, but once they're constructed, there were concerns raised about impacts for noise, impacts for additional trails being created or extending. And then part of that is that, will people cut corners and create their own trails by riders? Well, the experience that we have had at council is that largely hasn't eventuated. Where there's been a trail network that has been provided and properly constructed and maintained, most riders are actually using that experience and following that and are actually keeping to the trails. Now, we do have heavy use of that facility, and you'll see the note there at the bottom where we talk about it's really well used and enjoyed by the community, and it's managed and maintained. And we have in the order of 2,500 to 3,500 laps completed each month. So there is wear there, but there is also maintenance that council provides there so that it is able to better handle that level of usage. Now I just want to come to Westley specifically, as we've sort of talked more broadly about the journey that council has come to this point in mountain, addressing this unmet demand for mountain biking. So for Westley, I think most people on this webinar know that it was for many years owned by Sydney Water, and council bought it in 2016 with the purpose of providing new recreation facilities for the community. And those recreation facilities were in mind for both structured and unstructured recreation, passive and active recreation. The site is quite large overall, and it has about 10 hectares of it that's cleared, and then the remaining parts of the site are under bushland. We know that the site, because of its historical uses, does have some contamination across the site, and that ranges from some fragments of asbestos, which are in both the cleared area and in the fringing areas of the bushland, along with some soil contamination. And as council looks at it, turning the site into a recreation precinct, we will have an obligation, and we will be remediating that site. And we've had a remediation plan prepared to do that. And the reason I flag that is because that applies both to the cleared area, the grassed area, but also to some of the areas fringing where we know that there has been some contamination. We have an obligation to appropriately remediate that. And the techniques may be slightly different in each of the areas, but it's a process that we know we have to work through. The other points.
Let's jump in for 1 second. So we are at time, but that's totally fine because we're recording the webinar. So we are at 1 o'clock. But what I just invite you to do, if you can please just continue. Anyone who needs to jump off for other commitments, that's fine. We'll be posting this online. but I think it's really important that we hear the rest of this presentation. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Darius. So we know also that when council purchased the site, there were existing trails in the natural areas of the site, and those trails had been in existence for many years, and they've been well established. And I think we've heard discussion earlier about what the community values on those are. I make the comment that there was tacit approval for the trail works, in the sense that the trails had been present for many years, and we're not aware that Sydney Water either prohibited or endorsed the trails. But I suppose there's been the point I'm trying to make there is that there's been long-standing use of that space. So I want to come then to, I suppose, the frame of reference for the current process we're going through. Last year, council proposed a draft master plan for Westley Park, and it looked at both the cleared grass area where sporting fields, a range of sporting activities were proposed, but also in this space here. Now, overall, we went through a community consultation process there on that draft master plan, and some of the feedback through that engagement came back and found that, the majority of residents, I think it was about 75%, felt that draft master plan had a good balance of active and passive recreation uses. And then when we looked at the balance of restoring and protecting the natural environment, the feedback that we had from residents was in the order of 80% thought there was a good balance while also providing that diverse range of recreation activities. Now, on face value, that would tell you, well, then it's, that was appropriate and, about right, and council could proceed. But underneath that, when you came to it, there was an area where the issue of how the natural areas are being used and proposed to use came out clearly, where what council had put forward certainly got a lot of feedback from all sides of the community about whether that was suitable or not. And we had many submissions saying, look, the trail layout that council had proposed at that point in time wasn't suitable, and part of that was because of concerns for impact on natural area, but equally because there was a view put forward that the rationalisation of those trails really limited what was being provided on the site, and it was too great an issue. So council didn't adopt that final master plan, but actually did pass a resolution where what it actually noted was that, and these are a few points out of a broader resolution that I'm flagging here, was essentially saying that, mountain biking does have a place, it is legitimate, but really it needs to be on improved trails where we can endorse, maintain and manage those. It did flag that broader issue of, unmet demand, and noted that, yes, Hornsby provides a purpose-built mountain bike trail at Hornsby Park or Old Man's Valley, but the experience that's there doesn't cater for people entering into the sport. And it did ask that we go and conduct further engagement about what might be a suitable trail alignment at Westley Park, and noted that there's a range of experiences that are being there. But importantly, it also recognised that there is high value biodiversity on the site that can't be discounted. I think to a point that Catherine made, council also recognised that one site can't fix all demand. And, we have that as a case in point for Old Man's Valley or Hornsby Park. Hornsby has an approved mountain biking trail, but there's still demand and there's still desire for people to continue riding. I think extending that with a discussion at Westley and even beyond, I think it's saying that, we have to look both at Westley, but also more widely. And the final point I wanted to touch on here was that we also have a key initiative that we're progressing to prepare a natural areas recreation strategy, and there'll be multiple stakeholder engagement and all groups will be involved in developing that strategy. So looking at what are we addressing here at Westley, following our purchase of the site, council started commencing its planning work on a master plan that would set out really how that site could be developed to meet the various recreational demands that we'd identified for the Shire. Part of that was undertaking a range of technical studies that helped inform that, and they ranged from contamination studies, traffic studies, and various environmental studies. And critically to this discussion, those studies did identify the presence of the critically endangered ecological communities, the endangered ecological communities and threatened species that are present on bushland areas of the Westley site. And probably the key challenge or the tension that we're seeing now is that where those higher value biodiversity areas are on the site, they're concentrated in the area where the beginner and intermediate trails are on the site. So we've got both of those values coming to play at the same space on the site. I briefly put this slide up just to show the vegetation on the site. I'm not sure if my cursor works, I hope it does, but you'll see the orange colour is our Sydney turpentine ironbark forest, which is a critically endangered community. The blue next to it is Duffy's Forest, which is an endangered community, and there is some hashing that you can see which shows in that general area there are a range of other threatened species. So you'll notice most clearly on that the southern part of the site is where probably the more sensitive vegetation is concentrated, and then we know that that's where the parts of the trail network that are really the community are placing value on for the riding experience for beginners and intermediate riders. So I suppose that really brings us to the key point that we're trying to resolve through this co-design process, and that's we've heard very clearly from the mountain biking community that the experience that is valued, particularly at Westley, is the beginner and intermediate trails and that progression. But also we've got this environmental constraint that sits there, and neither of them can be discounted. They're both really important points, and thus we're trying to work through a co-design process that is seeking to try and say, what is that suitable trail layout that could be prepared for the site? That has to be done understanding all the drivers and all the constraints, and the environmental legislation is something that we do have to have regard to, and it's based on a range of principles, and it has both state and Commonwealth that we need to bear in mind, which talks about principles of avoiding, minimising and mitigating those, and they have to be taken into account when we're working through a preferred trail layout. I'm going to diverge slightly here and sort of say, well, they're important principles, and I'm going to give a different example of where council has applied those principles. So I hope people on this call are generally familiar with Fagan Park, and council, there's a section of bushland at Fagan's Park called Carrs Creek Bushland, and that's a section of bushland that is Sydney turpentine ironbark forest, which has critically endangered status. Now, in that location, there's been a range of walking tracks that are maintained by council, and they've been there for many years. And there's a desire to provide an accessible walking track by council. So we went through a process that said, well, how do we provide an experience that we want to maintain or give to people in very sensitive bushland? And how do we apply these principles of avoid, minimise and mitigate? And so with avoid, we looked at and said, well, no, there's a desire to provide that accessible trail through there and allow people to enjoy this space. And in applying that, we looked at we closed some tracks and consolidated routes, and we weren't proposing to provide any further trails in there. When we looked at minimising, we sought to reduce the intensity of the trails and build within the existing footprint of some trails there. And when we looked at mitigating, we then looked at what are the appropriate construction techniques in design that we can put into place there that will address some of those environmental challenges that you get with trails, be it soil compaction, fauna movements, and a range of things. So the legislation does set principles that council can't avoid. We have to work through those and be aware of those. But we do need to take into account all the different inputs there. Why I bring that up is that we are wanting through this co-design to come up with a suitable approach for Westley that then gets incorporated into a site master plan, and following that a development application for the site. Now, I want to make it really clear that council's going through a process where ultimately, when it comes to a development application, council will be the proponent, we'll be the ones lodging the DA. And the process that we're going through at the moment is we're trying to get to a view with the community to say what's suitable for this site. It's almost like we're trying to come up with the designs for our house and saying what are the plans that we want for that, but we then lodge it. And because council lodges it, we can't assess it ourselves, and that means that the assessment by the planning staff, that'll be assessed by an independent planner, totally independent of council, and it will also be assessed and determined ultimately independent of council by the Sydney North Planning Panel, and they will have to assess that against the relevant legislation. So we do need to be really mindful of what that legislation is and how we address that. And a lot of it is scale and extent. You know, what are the overall impacts from the site that will be experienced here for what council is proposing. I briefly want to touch also on the proposed link between Westley Park and Hornsby Park. That was something that was placed on public comment too, and it's something to bear in mind. Most of the discussion is specifically about the trail alignment on Westley Park, but we're mindful that we do have the two facilities and what could a connection be. And what had been suggested by council was a way for an off-road connection between the two sites. And for the vast majority of the connection that's proposed, and I'm mindful that that image may be a little bit small for people, but on council's website that can be accessed, was to say, if there's a desire and there's a way to provide a connection between the two for walking and cycling, how could we do that? And it's really looking at using the existing trails, and the vast majority, greater than 90% of that, is existing fire trail network where people can access currently. Looking at what's available on council land. There's a comment there that some is on the National Park Estate, but that's a small section of fire trail where there currently is provision for that access. And looking at how do we minimise the impacts upon higher conservation value vegetation, such as the biobank where we've got blue gum, and trying to minimise that. So I just raise that just to note that as we go through this co-design, the primary focus is on Westley Park itself, but we do want to also be mindful and aware of whether a connection can be provided between two sites. Now, probably just to recap, and on my final slide, I wanted to talk about the next steps, which is we are working through this co-design process, and we're really trying to have regard to what council resolved and asked us to do last year, which is to say, work through a design with stakeholders and say, what would be a suitable trail alignment for the site? That vision then informs the site master plan, which will be presented back to council and asking council to endorse. But beyond that point, once we get a master plan, then a DA is prepared and assessed. And I really wanted to stress that will be assessed independently of council. It'll be determined independent of council, and it will have to have regard to the relevant legislation. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate that. And there's some really key points there that are really important as we go into the next stage of engagement. So we are a little bit over time, but I appreciate everyone bearing with us. We had hardly anyone drop off there, so everyone's really keen to hear all the information. The next steps, as we've mentioned a few times, are the expressions of interest for the co-design panel. Everyone who's on this email and anyone who's expressed interest throughout the process will get an email about how to be involved in that. And I'd just really like to thank our presenters, Catherine, Phil and Steve, for all of their input today. And there are a lot of comments and questions in the chat to the panelists. So those comments will be noted along with all of the other engagement we've done today. And the questions will go away and we'll see how we can best address them and share them with the broader community as we go to the next stage. So thank you everyone for jumping online and participating. We've just had a quick question, how many people attended online? Did have about 60 people, so about 60 participants plus our panelists, so about 65 total. And in the workshops, we've had 100 face-to-face so far, so we've had a really good reach for the engagement. And thank you to people who are giving some nice comments and thanking us in the chat as well. And it means a lot to us. All righty, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone, and we hope to see you again at the future engagement. Bye.